Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Hager, and this is my final presentation for ESOC 318 on a contemporary disruptive technology. And the disruptive technology that I chose was graphical user interfaces, or GUIs for short. If you look at the image there, there's an example of a GUI, and it's one of its earlier formats from the Xerox Star operating system. And I'll discuss a little bit about the Xerox Star, but essentially GUIs are things that humans can use to look at computer information and then interact with it more effectively. First, I'll start off by defining disruptive technology as we've learned about it here in ESOC 318 this semester. Four criteria really. Technology that displaces an obsolete technology can be considered disruptive. And when that technology disrupts and displaces obsolete technology, it can create new industries in its wake. Also, a disruptive technology can take something that already exists but improves upon it. But most importantly, technology's true measure of how it's disruptive is how it changes human nature, how it changes how humans interact with each other and with that technology. Kind of an interesting quote I found doing some research was from Jay Sammet, who is a self-described serial disruptor. Disruptors don't have to discover something new. They just have to discover a practical use for new discoveries. And GUIs really did that in a sense because computers already existed before GUIs. But GUIs essentially allowed users to interact with computers in a more effective way. And one of these more effective manners in which GUIs helped and they displaced obsolete technology, you can see in the picture there, an example of a CDC 6600, which in 1964 was the best computer in the world. And it worked by swapping out cassettes and tape reels for memory, and then also putting in punch cards for users to do input. It required a lot of training in order to use this. A person who had no interaction with the 6600 couldn't walk into this room and learn how to use it effectively because there was no way for a person to see what the computer was putting out, only be able to read punch cards and paper printouts from this computer. So GUIs displace this old way of looking at computers by giving a means to connect with the computer platform. And it also improved upon existing tech. It took those large computers that I was discussing in the previous slide and put them from large corporations in giant rooms and brought them down to living rooms. By the GUI allowed everyday users to interact with the computer. And it also eliminated the need for advanced training on how to use these computer platforms. And it made computers more accessible to the masses, similar to how the printing press made reading and mass print production available to the masses. And it also created new industries. Before GUIs hit their mainstream in the 1980s, you had very few companies working and entities working on software and hardware development. You had your big two, which had Xerox and IBM. And then you had a lot of government and university research. But outside of that, you didn't have companies developing software or hardware at a level that we see today. But when graphical user interfaces entered the market, it created more markets, it created more industry for other companies to get involved. That's where you saw companies like Apple and Microsoft really start to enter the market and develop software and hardware for everyday users. And by creating these new industries, led to more development on GUIs. And eventually, this development would change how we interact with technology in smartphones. Without graphical user interfaces, you would not have arguably, you would not have smartphones. When the iPhone was released in 2007, Steve Jobs, during the keynote, said that they solved the smartphone problem when he was referring to the user interface 20 years ago with bitmap interfaces. And with that statement, what he was referring to is Apple and the industry changed how people work with computers back in the 80s. And then that same technology, that same idea of having an easy to use GUI changed how smartphones are used in society. Without these smartphones, you couldn't have easy to use applications such as maps or rideshare programs or social media, because you wouldn't have an intuitive way to use these. That intuitive aspect, or that extension of how people use technology and how we think about it, made a lot of this technology exist. And where some of this comes from, and where I would like to focus some of the history of GUI, is starting with Douglas Engelbart. Engelbart can arguably attribute it to fathering the idea of augmenting humans with computers. In his 1962 work, Augmenting Human Intellect, he was stated that humans needed to find better ways to augment their capability. He argued that problems were becoming so complex and so in need of humans to look at and solve them, that computing was the natural way to solve these. But computers needed to be, the access to computers needed to be intuitive and available to the masses. That would later lead to his 1968 work, where he demonstrated the online system, or OLS, and there is a picture of him demonstrating that in 1968. This would be referred to as the mother of all demos, because it was a proof of concept that you could use graphical user interfaces and peripherals, because this is also where we got the mouse from. These were both possible. In the mother of all demos, he was able to demonstrate bitmap, which essentially the graphical interface we see. He was also able to demonstrate interactive windows, real-time text editing, which had not been a thing up to this point, and really just give the sense that these sorts of things were possible. Now, while the online system would never be a commercial success, it was the watershed. Has been described as the watershed moment that led to further developments in GUI. And one of those standard bearers that took Engelbart's research, Engelbart's research, was Xerox. Xerox was a paper company at the time, focused on what we refer to as Xeroxing, or copying papers. However, part of the company did understand that computers and humans interactions being augmented by computers that was going to be the future. And one of the developments that came out of Xerox PARC was Xerox Alto in 1973. It took the concept of a modern office in the 70s with desktops and file systems and file folders, and put it into a graphical format for users to use. This desktop metaphor, which it has become known, would make it easier for users to visualize what they were working on. And the Xerox PARC, the Xerox Alto was the first computer system to use WIMP interface, which stands for Windows Icon Menus and Pointing Device, which WIMP is now essentially what every desktop operating system, not iOS, uses today. Eventually, the Xerox Alto would not actually see commercial production. It was largely just used there at Xerox PARC and in some academic and small small scale research applications. What would be mass produced in 1981 was the Xerox Star. The Xerox Star took the one additional step with the desktop metaphor and added the paper and file metaphor. Again, as I mentioned, Xerox being a paper copying company, they wanted users to see the screen and then print the screen out and then have an exact copy of that screen. And this became one of their selling points for the Xerox Star, and it was really the first commercial platform that really embraced what we've come to know as the modern desktop and the graphical user interface. Unfortunately, it wouldn't become a commercial success because of its expense. Outfitting a small office would cost roughly the equivalent of $200,000 back in 1981. But as the GUI disruptive technology progressed, the 1980s would see it come more into the mainstream. One of the stories of how this happened was an Apple visit to the Palo Alto Research Center in 1978, where Apple CEO at the time, Steve Jobs, was introduced to the idea of the desktop metaphor, and that changed how Apple was going to develop their computers. At the time, it was going back to you needed to know how to input commands properly into the computer system. And what this did was it gave Jobs a visualization that you could develop this GUI that made it accessible to more people, which would drive up your demand for your product. This 1978 visit would culminate in the development, the development of the Apple Lisa, which was Apple's first product that incorporated a graphical user interface in 1981. And then also later in the mid-80s, 1984, this would lead to the Apple Macintosh, which was one of Apple's largest products in the 1980s. It was becoming disruptive by taking a thing that already existed, computing already existed, but it was putting it into the homes of everyday Americans and every regular people across the world. And then where GUI also had a little bit more mainstream applicability was the Microsoft Windows operating system, which came about. Microsoft was developing software for Apple, but ended up offshooting on their own in the mid-80s and building a platform that was based on MS-DOS. And eventually it was its own operating system standalone by the mid-90s, which by the mid-90s, I was discovering computers for myself, and this is one reason I chose to talk about GUIs, as GUIs introduced me to computers. My first use of a computer operating system was on my buddy Nick Radke's IBM Aptiva in 1993, and there on the slide you can see an example of Microsoft 3.1. I grew up in a rural area with a school that didn't have any technology, so I was able to learn technology learn how to use computers over at my friend Nick's house because I didn't know anybody who knew how to program DOS or BASIC. And the only way I was able to get involved with technology was because of GUIs. I probably wouldn't have learned computers had it not been for that. And kind of going to today, GUIs continue to help me and help a lot of us because they go beyond smartphones and they allow things like distance learning to be possible. GUI, one development in GUIs was Web 2.0. Interactive media, better web browsers, Dropboxes, better security allowed things such as D2L, which we all use, to become possible. And by making this sort of thing possible, it allows not only technology, but education to be distributed to the masses. And that is one larger ramification of GUI on society, is that they have made technology such as smartphones possible. And by doing so, GUIs have reduced the tech divide and has enabled everyday people to use computers and items such as the smartphone to connect as to be an extension of themselves and connect with one another. GUIs enabled a user-friendly internet, and now because of GUIs, you now have an ability for anyone to discover anything they want with just a few navigations and taps of a button on the internet. Directions anywhere can be retrieved with a few taps of a screen on a smartphone. Notifications and photos can be shared with an endless network of friends and family. So you'd have connectivity and instant knowledge have become the result of GUIs closing that tech divide. And as you can see in the picture up there, GUIs have combined have put a number of techs into the palm of our hands. A person no longer has to be a computer programmer, a photographer, and a music aficionado. They simply just need to possess a smartphone to enjoy each one of these hobbies. Looking toward the future, arguably the future of GUI is already here. As was discussing on the previous slide, smartphones now have apps that employ augmented reality that allow users to see what is around them, play interactive games such as Pokemon, and make best use of the Internet of Things with smart homes. For example, my house has smart lights, so when I walk through the door, I have lights that come on as a result of me programming them to do so with the GUI on my telephone. Wearable tech, I put a comic of Dick Tracy shopping at his local Apple store there. While this is already possible, I think GUI is going to make wearable technology more expansive. So it's not just going to be on our watches, but in our clothing items as well. GUI is going to allow us to program those types of things, the sensors and feedback within clothing to give us data on our everyday lives, like how long do we wear this? How hot were we while we were wearing this? Would there be a more efficient way to use this particular clothing item? And then additionally, that type of information could be used by companies in exchange for products or services. So an example I can think of is a health insurance company may ask its customers to wear some of this wearable clothing or this wearable technology so they can monitor different activities, which is a bit scary, but in exchange, that company could provide lower insurance rates. And then kind of expanding on this, where GUIs are going, I have an example from the movie Minority Report, where you have interactive marketing. GUI I foresee it to be used in a manner like this, where if you walk into a store or you walk into, as I described with the smart home example before, you walk into a situation, you are now going to have an interface to work with that is going to make marketing more personalized, perhaps a little bit more intrusive, but certainly I could see how graphical user interfaces are going to drive those things into the future. In conclusion, the GUIs have changed how humans interact with computers, and they are a disruptive tech because they have done this. They've eliminated the barrier, I would argue, that is similar to how the printing press put print media to the masses. GUIs are how we interact with technology today. Smartphones and wearables let us best augment ourselves with technology. And going into the future, I think there's a lot of possibilities for GUIs to determine how companies may look at us and use our data for selling products, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. Certainly, GUIs have reduced that divide, but perhaps in the future they're going to create more issues with privacy as technology continues to augment our lives. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation, and if you pause on the last slide here, those are the works cited, and thanks, I appreciate it.